Hi, let's talk about Sinclair Lewis. From about 1920 to 1940, Sinclair Lewis was one of the most popular novelists in the United States. He was actually the first citizen of the United States to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, which happened in 1930. And today he's known mostly for six novels that reputation have survived somewhat, although he wrote something over a dozen. He started as a journalist and gradually transferred to becoming a fiction writer. And the books that have survived share very common features, except for one that's kind of the outlier. The one that's the outlier is called It Can't Happen Here. It was written in the mid 30s before World War II, and it's a hypothetical account of how the United States could become a fascist country, similar to Italy and Germany under Mussolini and Hitler. It has become unusually popular again in the last few years. I wouldn't be surprised if someone was working on turning it into like a TV miniseries. And unfortunately, it's not a very good book. It's uneven, and the main characters are very flat. But there are some very good passages about the kind of people in the 30s who you could imagine leading a sort of nativist American fascist movement. There's references to radio and the kind of inflammatory rhetoric of Father Coughlin. There's Henry Ford style stuff in there, and it presented as sort of like these kind of like condensed digests of fictional events with references to real people. Those parts that sort of set the tone of the world are very good. However, before the last few years, which made people in the United States so nervous about the prospect of an American fascist movement, Lewis's reputation mostly rested on these other five novels. The first was Main Street, then Babbitt, Elmer Gantry, Aerosmith, and Dodsworth. These all came out in the 1920s and were all very successful. They were all turned into pretty much all turned into movies at one point or another. Main Street in particular is the book that made his reputation and the one that probably talk about the most, because I think it's the one that has the that works the best as a novel. So Lewis was something of he was a satirist, and his skill was in observing the real foibles of the Americans of his time. He was very good at observing hypocrisy, which there's always plenty, but he was very good at observing it in a sort of detailed and nuanced way and presenting it in a kind of fast-paced, humorous vein. He was very good at showing the little bits of sort of unconscious received dialogue that people use to sort of fend each other off and make other people keep their distance. He was very good at setting this all at sort of a fast-paced vaudeville sketch style within his books, so that when you read them now, they're still quite funny. The slang may have changed, but it's very recognizable American humor in the vein of Mark Twain before and all the people who came after, like National Lampoon, Saturday Night Live. Like, Lewis is a solid American humorist and had a real ear for comedic dialogue, and also had a knack for presenting things in juxtaposition so that you would see the hypocrisy of his characters, who would espouse one thing and do another, or would be upset and angry at how they were treated by one person and then go and treat someone else someone they see as their inferior in exactly the same way. But he doesn't have his characters do not have a very believable inner world, and one of the deep pleasures of the novel is exploring characters' inner world, and that kind of locks away, that limits his work, that locks a lot of what could be done away. He's very good at what he does. He's very good at presentation of social realities. He's very good at setting these sort of artificial dialogue scenes into movement, and achieving, humorous and insightful effects. But he's not good at giving the inner world. Too often he just has characters implausibly and unnaturally just sort of state what's wrong with them. They just say what they're unhappy about or what makes them. They give speeches in a way that does not fit the sort of the naturalism that is generally expected now of characters in a serious novel. It saves a lot of time. There's a lot of he has large casts in his book. There's lots of characters, and in fact, some of them there's a sort of Sinclair Lewis universe. There's a few touches in other books of characters in his other books, like they inhabit the same shared American reality, and he, in these 5 novels, explores pretty significant chunks of American social life in the 1920s, which is completely fascinating when the U.S. was changing so quickly and was recognized as changing so quickly at that time by the people living in that era. And in each book, Lewis manages to explore like a major area of American life. So Dodsworth, he explores the world of sort of like the American gentry. Dodsworth is a man who owns a successful car factory. He's like the successful businessman, and he sells his factory, and he's going to explore like what else there is sort of to do in life. He takes his wife to Europe, and he's going to explore other values than that of pure business. In Aerosmith, he has a character who is drawn to be a medical researcher and to find a career in medicine, and he uses him to sort of explore all the little different areas of U.S. medicine and show just what barriers stand in the way between someone who really wants to try to achieve make some sort of scientific understanding come into being. In Elmer Gantry, this is one that I think Burt Lancaster made a movie of in sometime in the 40s or 50s, and he did a great job. Elmer Gantry is a aspiring preacher. He's promised his mother that he will be a preacher, and he uses Gantry as a character to explore American religion during this period, which was a great period for sort of evangelical and Pentecostal revivalism, and he sends Gantry around the country interacting with different kinds of people and exploring different kinds of religious behavior and faith. There's Babbitt. Babbitt is a character who became a word. At one point you could just call someone a Babbitt. A Babbitt is a sort of self-satisfied, hypocritical, middle class, bourgeois businessman type person who is really like kind of closed-minded and generally generally ignorant and hypocritical person. The Babbitt in the book, though, is a reasonably. Lewis has a lot of sympathy for his predicament. Talk about Babbitt. Babbitt is probably his second best book after Main Street, so we'll talk about Babbitt and build to Main Street. Babbitt lives in a small, mid-sized Midwestern city. I sort of get the feeling it's Cincinnati. It's not named, but it's something like that. And he works at a real estate office, and he's like the manager of these realtors, and married into it. He married the daughter of the owner, and he lives in this suburb, and he drives into work. He goes to the country club, not the really fancy country club. He goes to like the second tier country club that pretty much lets anybody in, and he hangs out with guys who he knew from the fraternity in college that he went to. He tells the same jokes. He makes a good living, and he expects to send his own children to college. He buys little gadgets with his extra surplus income. He like has, they have servants, and he likes to buy little gadgets like, a fancy lighter or some sort of doodad that he can have around the house. And he's a generally unhappy man. He spends his life keeping up a social position that he inherited the opportunity to have, but didn't really choose for himself. He's learned how to keep it up. He does this sort of rough and tumble of real estate in one of these cities, where you have to learn in advance what lots are going to become more valuable and pick them up cheap, and then you have to tip bankers to opportunities so that they'll extend you credit. He does that fine. He talks a lot about being an ethical businessman to his employees, and then goes out and behaves reasonably unethically. That's kind of the classic Sinclair Lewis hypocrisy at work. He has a friend who he's close to who's also quite unhappy with his life, and they have a somewhat they have a fairly sincere private bond that they occasionally get to express to each other, but it doesn't go much beyond sharing that they're just not happy with their lives. And Babbitt is a little happier in his marriage than his friend, but his friend is quite unhappy in his marriage and his work, and is prone to sort of aesthetic outbursts against the way in which he lives. This is all very artificial, but it does get the point across. Lewis's novels are not meant to be that realistic. The characters act very implausibly, and they have very unusual access to like the different levels of their society. But this is all because Lewis is most interested in just using them as ways to explore those different aspects of the society, and so he has them, just kind of casually meet someone who takes them on to the next portion of the society that Lewis wants to write about. And it's not realistic, but it's not bad. It is one of the things you can do with a novel, which is use it as sort of an anatomy of the society around you, and send your characters sort of careening through it, bumping up against things so that you can talk about it, and you can explore the kind of people that are out there and the pressures that they live under and that kind of thing. Babbitt is, Lewis I think said he meant Babbitt partly, obviously, he pokes a lot of fun at him, and he shows his hypocrisy pretty well, but he does have sympathy for him, and I think that's genuine. It's not just a total scathing satire, like looking down on this guy. He has some sympathy for his plight. There's a pretty well done scene where Babbitt remembers a trip he once took to Maine, and he wants to go back to Maine and get away for a while and do some like outdoor living, and he goes to his wife to suggest it, and at first she gives him a little pushback and says, maybe next year or months ahead, and he just sort of suddenly starts to break down in hysteria and tell her, I can't take it anymore, I've got to get out of this, and she instantly seems to know what he means and tells him, okay, it's all right, you can go, and that's very well done. The hysteria behind the pace of independent businessmen like Babbitt is it's real. J.P. Morgan, for example, and you can't say anyone was a better businessman than him, would regularly have almost nervous breakdowns after he'd done one of his giant mergers or big corporate maneuvers, and he would go off for weeks to rest and sort of recover his nerve. On a much more minor level, Babbitt is doing this, and he goes off to Maine, and he has a wonderful time. He tries to make friends with the guide. This is back when you hired like a guide to carry you around Maine, and he has this great sort of canoeing John McPhee forest country kind of experience up there, and he asks his guide what he looks for out of life, thinking of course that his guide has got set of the world on a string and living in this beautiful country, and the guide reveals to him that he's always dreamed of opening a shoe store. Which is great. Like, Lewis really knows how to deflate a scene. He will end on some kind of deflating the tension line where, somebody sort of brings the whole world back to reality with a plop, and then the scene just ends. And it's pretty effective. uh, Babbitt, explores the rest of what his city has to offer, and it's during Prohibitions. They cover some of Prohibition. He talks about union stuff. He meets, he digs into his own past and tries to find what he could have done different a little bit. Um, but it's mostly an organized series of pretty well done, like, little skits or sketches. It would be easy to imagine this book reset as a series of short stories, for example, with Babbitt as the continuing through character. There was a lot of that in the 20s. There were more short stories in the periodicals, and you could imagine building novels out of these. And there was also just a ton of what we might see now as the forerunner of modern snark. I don't want to. I don't know enough to say for sure, but I get the feeling sometimes that in the 20s, after World War One, there was the birth of the snarky, snide, sardonic, ironical literature that went on to have a huge influence all across American culture, certainly into the mass media and TV and the movies. And there were all these writers who used that a lot. Ring Lardner is one. They used this kind of knowing tone where they would write the stories in such a way that the reader often knew more about what was going on than the characters did, and the characters were often sort of pinned to the wall by the hypocrisy that the authors have noticed about them. Dorothy Parker was writing at this period, Robert Benchley, Donald Ogden Stewart, the whole Algonquin Club scene, and Lewis kind of fits into this pattern of people who are writing uh, stories that encourage the reader to not to sympathize with the characters too much, but to sort of like laugh at their society. They don't tend to go beyond that and propose anything constructive, like a more pure, like a different kind of satire might. It's just more of the this again, you know, like, oh, look at this, this isn't going to work out well, kind of attitude. And there's usually still a happy ending involved, but increasingly, of course, as time went on, we found that people were willing to do without that happy ending and settle for just a sort of evisceration of their time and place and an exposure of hypocrisy without suggesting too much that anything could actually be done about it. Um, this sort of reductive, flat, negative attitude is it isn't productive necessarily of anything, but it's often something people find valuable because it's a little reassuring sometimes to have someone tell you, yeah, things are as rough as you fear or as rough as you thought, but we can laugh at it, and it's a little encouraging sometimes. People have trouble living up to their illusions about the world. So is that fair? I think that's fair. People have trouble living up to the inflated illusions that we carry around about the world and how it works, and it can be helpful to, prick those illusions and pop them and reveal the flawed and inadequate people behind the illusions. Now, people who want a more sort of inspirational literature usually find these attitudes, and it's an inspirational literature and inspirational culture, they'll find this attitude unhelpful, at best, downright dangerous, definitely find it irritating. But it exists for a reason, and if it grew out of this period, there was a lot of hypocrisy to deflate. The ideals and the way that America talked about itself was changing a lot in the 1920s, and so there was a lot of room for the deflation or the pointing out of incongruities between what was said about how people lived and how they were actually living. And that hasn't really ended over the last century. There's always plenty of room to make literature out of that disconnect. Okay, going on to Main Street. Main Street is the best book. If you had to read one Sinclair Lewis novel, I would suggest Main Street. It has the best developed central character, a woman named Carol, and it has the most modestly plausible scenario. Carol is a young woman who goes to college, and we know a little bit about her background. She had a happy childhood and a generally sort of fulfilling attitude. She's a pretty good person when we meet her, and she is working as a librarian in the city, and she's proposed marriage to by this guy who is a doctor in a small town, some distance away from the city. And she accepts, and the book is her sort of exploring the possibilities of the small town that she moves to. If you had to sum it up, that could be it. She moves to this small town, and she tries to explore. She explores what is there and what is there to be. How is her life going to be lived there? What is she going to do? As a doctor's wife, she doesn't have to engage in a paid employment, and there isn't any for her anyway, so she's free to sort of meet people and to use her social position to see sort of what can be done with this town and these people. And one by one over a period of years, as she gets to know people and explores what there is to do, she tests kind of all the main areas of life, looking for something that she will find fulfilling. So she looks into the religion in the town. She looks into the politics of the town. She looks into education. She looks into volunteering. She looks into art. Like at one point she is going to direct an amateur play in the town. She looks into the treatment of the less well-off in the town, and just gradually explores what is she to do? What kind of life is she going to have? And it's reasonably plausible to imagine this. Like, she doesn't do anything really unlikely, as tends to happen to the characters in the other books. She does things you can imagine being real things. And Lewis grew up in a town like this, and his father was a doctor, and his mother was a college-educated woman who moved to the town. So he just knows this really well, and it comes to life in a thousand little details. Lewis was a journalist, I believe. Did I say that already? He was a journalist, and he had a good journalist's eye for facts, and he could set a scene. And this is what makes the humor of his stuff emerge so well, is that it's really well observed detail. Like, for example, at one point Carol agrees to be on the board of the town library, and they have these meetings, and she's friends with the town librarian, although they're not exactly simpatico, but they're friendly, and they're both educated, well-read women, and so they take an interest in each other. And the other members of the board are like such penny pinchers. They're such like, oh my gosh, we have to watch this is all funded by taxes, and it's just more or less sacred. This is that era when libraries saw their mission, and this is brought out not to encourage literacy or reading, but to sort of like be shrines to books. So if you bought a book, libraries would often sometimes like sort of passively resist anyone actually using it. They were more concerned about protecting the value of the book itself. And you imagine Lewis maybe running into this as a kid, but if you were like a kid and you were hard on a book and you returned it and they said it was damaged, you might find your library borrowing privileges revoked, or have a hard time. They'll only give you stuff, but it can't be new. And it's just, in general, like, that's what Carol discovers time and time again, is just this carping, sort of hassling, gossipy, detail-minded, missing the forest for the trees, penny pinching, querulous, isolated, cultureless, just generally foolish and full of itself and doesn't know how stupid they are kind of attitude among all the people in this They're not bad people. They're normal people. They're totally normal, but she just can't. As someone who comes from outside, knows that there are different ways to be. She can't fully enter into just like their unconscious taboos and their sense of pride in themselves, and so she keeps seeing things from the outside, and then either resisting them or making some kind of joke about it that no one will get, but that makes her happy, or making some kind of snide remark. And so they're like bothering this librarian lady at this meeting over like 2 cents missing from the budget, and she's like holding her head. And I hope none of you have been in meetings like this, but just like this, like, why are we talking about this so much? Isn't our time worth anything? Why we gotta run each other down and find out who made some dumb mistake about literally 2 cents? Um, so she explores, like sort of he does Lewis does a good job of sending her around. She explores the possibilities of culture, like through this book club and this amateur theatrics, and she finds out, of course, that people's taste and their sense of what's proper, which is kind of like quasi religious, really limits anything you can do there. She finds that the other women who she's like destined to associate with, because her husband's a doctor, and so she can only associate with the women who are reasonably well off, are just kind of like, they're not bad one-on-one. She can be friends with them solo, but like they just play bridge, and they like go around donating clothes to like poorer families in a really patronizing way, and worrying about little bits of unimportant stuff. It's not awful. It's not like a completely awful life. It would be too bad. But there's just scene after scene that like break your heart a little. Like before she eventually does have children, and but before that, at one point, she's out there in this town, and it's just snowed, and she's still reasonably young, and she goes running through the snow and jumps in the air and lands in a snowbank and going wee, and some of the women see her do this, and she looks at them, and they look at her with this kind of horror at her unladylike behavior, and Lewis has a line something along the lines of like, that was the last time that she got to act like a little girl. Carol doesn't have like a specific detailed vision for what life should be like in this town, but she does want it to be something more, something different, more fun, like jumping in the snowbank. She begs her friends to become real, like sort of outdoor sports, and just have lots of physical fun, skiing and skating and rowing in the summer and going for rides. And she, or the life of sort of the mind. She wants the library to carry better books, and she wants the book clubs to read better books and to encourage kids to read better stuff and learn. Or the politics, she wants the politics in the town to be better instead of just a bunch of guys. This is pre-suffrage, of course, so she doesn't even vote. Just a bunch of guys hanging around the bar talking about this, that, and the other, and they always wind up electing the bar owner or the bar owner as the mayor, which did happen quite a bit in the U.S. Owning a bar was a good ticket to politics back then. Probably still is today. I wouldn't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. She just wants it. She wants. At one point, she gets interested in the physical look of the town because it's kind of a dump. There's like a couple dozen really nice houses, and then there's a bunch of ones that are just kind of like, mail order Sears and Roebuck, and there's a bunch that are just hovels. So she tries to get the rich people in town together to basically design a whole new town and create like a model town, and they just absolutely shoot her down. Basically, everyone is happy with how life is in this town except her, because they've always lived here and they see it as the natural, normal state of affairs. This book was moderately controversial when it came out, and it sold really well, and was probably one of the more widely read novels in U.S. history in its day, when you consider the shifts in the country's population. And it created a lot of controversy about whether American towns, the small towns, this town is about 5,000 people, were really as sort of blinkered and self-satisfied as presented, because Lewis does take the satire to a pretty high tone in this book, and some of it is pretty severe. Like At one point, during the war effort in World War One, some of the guys in town chase out a labor organizer in a kind of quasi vigilante kind of way, uh, and Carol doesn't approve of that at all. Uh, they have they have what's called a white way. This was something around 1900, a way to display your town's prosperity and sense of itself in the hope of attracting more business to your town. Was you just got a bunch of electric lights. It's just still a new thing, and you lit up your town at night, and they were called white ways. They were probably based off something like the White City at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. But for a few years, this was just a popular thing to do to sort of boost your town and show off that you were advanced, and also maybe get some business to move there and increase your tax base. Well, Lewis just just rips that up, and just mocks the town mercilessly for its silliness and thinking that a few electric lights were suddenly going to make them all rich. They're visited by a Chautauqua, which were these like traveling, supposedly educational like fairs. They would come to town and they would have lecturers and displays of science, and Lewis must have been to some of these when he was young, because he does a whole sequence on them. It just shows them they're just the most kind of. They're just there to flatter the town and tell them that they're already doing everything great, and put on little pageants and give little inspirational speeches and sing patriotic songs. And there's no real education happening. In fact, in general, the message of Lewis's books might be everybody in the U.S. is pretty damn pleased with themselves. They're always patting each other on the back about how great they are. And his characters are the ones who are not quite wholly in on this, but they move in that world. They move in the world of the boosters. I think that's a term that's still generally well known. People who would like boost a town. You travel and you talk about how great your town is. I actually just read a really good classic booster article about Florida for Ron DeSantis, the current governor, and just talking about how great Florida is, and people move there and they immediately it changes their life, and they discover their real love and their passion is restored, and all you got to do is move to Florida because Ron DeSantis has this state working right. So this is all in Lewis's books. Lewis's books really, although they do not succeed hugely as novels in terms of realism, and don't always develop. They do not have like really, really, deeply satisfying characters and so on. But they are well observed social satires, and if you just update the language and change the technology involved, it could totally be written today. Not that much has changed in the United States. The social stuff that he's noticed, the little details of hypocrisy and of general focus on sort of individual achievement at the expense of your group among the American middle and upper class, the attitude among sort of the competitiveness, the sort of pointless hysteria. It's all still there. It's all still there. Lewis brings it to the surface pretty well, and by setting it, in the past, I think it actually helps see how it's still around here in the present, because it's unfamiliar, it's unfamiliar because it's 100 years ago, but it's not so unfamiliar that you can't see the connections. Kind of like with Mark Twain's stories, when he observes so well about the United States by setting it in the past and stripping away stuff that would distract you. If it was set in the present, it would pass too naturally as just kind of how things are. But you can see the same behavior among your countrymen today as you could, as Lewis could in the 20s. So if you want to have a reasonably fun time learning about the self-satisfied hypocrisy of citizens of the United States, especially the ones who think that they've kind of got the world on a string and have mastered everything, you could sure as heck do worse than the novels of Sinclair Lewis. They're all still in print. They're generally fun. I'm really curious as to why the Nobel Prize Committee gave him a Nobel Prize. The prize was different back then. Maybe they just figured they had to give it to some American because it had been too long without giving them one. I don't know. It would be interesting to sit in on that decision because it's hard to see how the work of Sinclair Lewis leads to a better world, which is generally what the Nobel Prize for Literature aims at, is writers who have works that are considered sort of socially responsible and help us advance as a species, which is why so many writers who are just great but have no interest in that have never gotten the Nobel. And Lewis, although I guess exposing hypocrisy and being a reasonably good chronicler of certain parts of American society could be seen as helpful. It's helpful the way that like someone telling you your problems and your faults and not really having anything else to suggest, but they won't stop, right? Like, you're doing this wrong. Oh man, that looks like crap. Hey, you really should, think about doing this. Um, I guess it's a start, knowing about what's going wrong, and knowing also that this has been going on a long time. I find comforting. I don't know if that's a common attitude, but for me, when I hear about the problems of the past being so similar to the problems of the present, in general, that helps me endure and deal with the problems of the present better, because I feel a commonality with the people back then, and it doesn't usually lead me to a sense of oh my gosh, we're still dealing with this. It doesn't fill me with anger or frustration that these things aren't over yet. I sort of have a more of a this again. Here we go. Parochialism, bourgeois, materialism, hypocrisy, making laws that govern the weak but are more or less de facto don't exist for the strong. Here we go again. So, Sinclair Lewis might give you some insights into things going on today, and it will probably give you some pretty good laughs because there's a pretty decent comic sequence every 10 pages or so. Enjoy.